Imagine driving down a vast, seemingly endless stretch of asphalt.
Like a totally open highway.
Right, exactly. We will call it the open highway. So the road is smooth, the sky is clear, your foot is steady on the gas.
Sounds like a nice drive.
It does, right. But as you look out your window, out onto the shoulders of this highway, you start to notice something, well, deeply unsettling.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. The entire length of the road is just lined with wreckage. Rusted out chassis of massive vehicles, twisted metal, shattered glass.
Just like the remnants of past travelers.
Exactly. The scattered remnants of people who crashed and burned. And the most bizarre part is that this wreckage hasn't been cleared away.
Oh, wow. It's just sitting there.
Just sitting there. It's been left completely untouched, preserved right there on the edge of the road. I mean, mile after mile. And you are driving the exact same route they did, just passing all the ruins.
It is a haunting image, really. But it actually perfectly captures the reality of human history when you strip away all the mythology.
Yeah, because we tend to think of history as this mysterious kind of unknowable void, right? Or maybe just a dry list of dates and names you memorize in school.
Right, but it's neither of those things. History is, well, it's an open-air laboratory. It is a permanent exhibition of cause and effect.
And that is exactly what we are getting into today. We are pulling out the black box of human history to do some civilizational forensics on that wreckage.
I love that term, civilizational forensics.
Right. So today's deep dive is based on Lecture 3 of 4 from the Tului Islam Digital Archive, specifically exploring verses 43 through 77 of Surah Al-Hijr. And the mission here is to decode a highly specific framework known as social physics.
Social physics. That is a weighty concept.
It really is. We are looking at how internal human psychology, the mechanisms operating quietly inside our own minds and hearts, how that doesn't just impact our private lives.
Right. It directly and measurably shapes the trajectory of whole societies.
Exactly. The rise and ultimate collapse of entire civilizations. Just as gravity and thermodynamics govern the physical universe, we're exploring the argument that there are immutable laws of social physics that govern us.
And to decode these laws, you really have to look closely at the underlying architecture of human motivation.
Yeah.
And the framework we are examining today, it basically begins by dismantling a very old, very entrenched concept.
Which is?
The idea of dualism. For millennia, humans have conceptualized the world as this cosmic battlefield where a god of light and a god of darkness are locked in an equal arm wrestling match.
Oh, right. Like they're pulling our strings like puppets.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the paradigm we are diving into completely rejects that externalization of evil. It introduces the allegory of Iblis, often translated as Satan, but it reframes it entirely.
I really want to dig right into that reframing because the allegory of Iblis here is just fascinating. And the narrative, Iblis is seeking revenge against humanity, right?
Right. Out to prove we are fundamentally flawed.
Yeah, but then he makes this stunning confession. He blatantly admits that he has absolutely zero power. Like no physical dominance, no coercive authority over anyone who is genuinely aligned with constructive laws.
He explicitly states he cannot force a human being to do anything.
Exactly. He says he can only mislead those who willingly hand over the steering wheel. Okay, so let's unpack this. Evil isn't some external monster forcing our hand.
Not at all. It completely shatters that idea. It forces absolute accountability back onto the human being.
So if Iblis isn't an external goblin or like a dark deity, then what is he?
Within this framework, Iblis is an allegory for something entirely internal.
Okay.
He represents the raw, unbridled, animalistic passions and emotions within the human psyche.
Yeah.
The text actually refers to it as the beast in man.
See, I struggle with that terminology a bit.
How so?
Well, when we hear the beast in man, our immediate cultural reflex is, suppression. We are conditioned to believe that our emotions are inherently dangerous or even evil.
Right. The ascetic tradition tells us we need to kill the ego.
Yeah, suppress your anger, crush your desires, transcend your pride to reach enlightenment. But if we are talking about the mechanics of actually building a civilization, a suppressed society doesn't achieve anything.
And that is precisely the psychological paradigm shift this text introduces. Emotions themselves are absolutely not evil.
Wait, really? Not evil at all?
Not at all. In fact, no human action, no progress, no architecture, no justice is possible without the driving force of emotion.
Okay, that makes sense.
Reason can draw a brilliant blueprint for a society, but reason does not have an engine. Emotion is the horsepower.
It's the incredibly potent internal energy source. Let's use an engineering analogy here.
Okay, I like analogies.
If you have a nuclear reactor, the uranium itself isn't evil. It is just raw, concentrated energy.
Right, it just exists.
Yeah, and if that energy is left uncontained and unregulated, well, it causes a catastrophic meltdown. That meltdown is the state of Iblis.
That is a great way to put it.
But if you encase that exact same uranium within control rods, if you regulate it and channel it, it generates the electricity to power an entire city.
That is a perfect visualization of social physics right there. The control rods, in your analogy, they represent the divine code or the objective laws of human preservation.
Okay.
The tragedy of a civilizational meltdown happens when the intellect becomes a slave to the passions, rather than the passions being guided by the intellect and that objective code.
So when the energy of desire is regulated by mutual consent, it becomes the foundation of a thriving family.
Exactly, and a robust economy.
Uh-huh.
But when that same desire becomes an unbridled craving for wealth, and your intellect is just reduced to acting as a clever lawyer.
Oh, just to justify your exploitation of others.
Right. When that happens, you have removed the control rods.
So the intellect can actually be weaponized by the beast.
Absolutely.
It's not just that people act like wild animals, it's that they use their high-level reasoning to become incredibly efficient, sophisticated predators.
Yes, and that sophisticated predation is exactly what builds the inferno, which, brings us to the ultimate destinations of this psychological trajectory.
Heaven and hell.
Right. We are so culturally conditioned to view these as purely physical rounds waiting for us in an afterlife.
Yeah, like a literal pit of lava versus a luxury resort in the clouds.
Exactly. But if the conflict with Iblis is fundamentally about internal human psychology, the ultimate destinations must be rooted in psychology as well.
So let's examine the mechanics of Jahannam, which is the term for hell in this text. It is described fundamentally as a state of intense psychological anxiety.
Yes, restlessness, deep internal agony.
What really stands out to me in the framework is the timeline. This state does not suddenly materialize after biological death. It begins right now.
In the physical world.
Yes, right here. There is this specific phrase used in the source. The fire of God that leaps over the hearts. It is an internal ignition.
The linguistic choice of leaping over the hearts is highly calculated, actually.
How so?
Well, in classical Arabic phrasing, the heart is the seat of emotion, consciousness, and intent.
Right.
So if you live a life of unbridled passion, if your daily existence requires exploiting others or maintaining a facade.
Or harboring deep-seated malice.
Exactly. If you do that, you are actively constructing a psychological furnace. You do not get thrown into a fire. You are carrying your own fuel.
The paranoia of losing your wealth, the crushing weight of hidden guilt that is the combustible material.
The insatiable, agonizing craving for more status, yes.
There is an anecdote referencing the philosopher Muhammad Iqbal that perfectly captures this mechanism.
Oh, I know the one you mean.
It's so good. He conceptualized this metaphorical journey where a man takes a guided tour of the afterlife, the man visits paradise, and then asks his guide for a quick glimpse into hell just to see what it looks like.
It's a quick peek.
Yeah. So he gets to the edge of the abyss, braces himself for the roaring flames and blistering heat, and feels nothing.
Nothing at all.
It is completely cold, just a dark, empty, freezing expanse. He asks the guide, "Where is the fire?"
And the guide replies, "There is no fire here. Everyone who comes here brings their own fire with them."
You bring your own fire. It is honestly one of the most chilling and philosophically robust concepts of accountability I have ever heard.
It really is.
Yeah.
In this physical life, if you have a raging fire in your heart, you have coping mechanisms.
Oh, sure. You buy a new car.
Right. You drown out the internal anxiety with retail therapy or endlessly scrolling through digital media.
Or immersing yourself in superficial social validation. You have distractions.
But the framework suggests that the next stage of human existence strips away every single distraction.
Leaving you with what?
Your internal psychological reality simply becomes your total external environment. You are finally left alone with the mind you built.
That is terrifying. So if the destination is the same internal breakdown, how do we look at the paths leading there?
Well, the text mentions that Jahannam has 7 separate gates.
Right, and that each group of transgressors has an assigned gate. A literalist draws a dungeon with 7 iron doors. But linguistically, what are we actually talking about here?
In classical Arabic, just as in English, when someone says, "I have a million things to do," numbers like 7 or 70 are idiomatic.
They don't literally mean 7.
Right, they represent a multitude. They denote plurality, not strict mathematical counts.
Okay, so the many gates symbolize the vast multitude of distinct behavioral pathways that all converge on the exact same psychological ruin.
Exactly.
I find that sociologically fascinating because the entry points look completely different, and the
Okay.
people walking through them often completely despise each other.
Oh, entirely.
Like, you have the gate of the ruthless, white-collar corporate embezzler, and you have the gate of the violent, unregulated street criminal.
And the wealthy hoarder looks down on the violent brute, feeling infinitely superior.
Yeah, civilized. And the violent brute looks at the hoarder and just sees a weak parasite. They do not recognize each other as walking the exact same trajectory.
But the social physics dictating their fate is blind to their class distinction.
The burning away of their human potential is identical.
They share no positive, constructive values, but they share the exact same outcome of self-destruction.
Wow.
And understanding this internal ruin provides the necessary contrast to understand Jannah, or paradise.
Okay, let's pivot to that.
If Jahannam is the paralysis of being trapped inside your own burning anxieties, paradise is characterized by infinite, unhindered growth.
Infinite growth. That completely upends the pop culture image of like a cosmic retirement home where you sit on a cloud playing a harp forever.
Right. A stagnant eternity sounds like its own kind of psychological torture, honestly.
It really
A
does.
stagnant eternity violates the very nature of consciousness. The root words used for human development in this text revolve around climbing, ascending, evolving.
So paradise is not the end of the journey.
No, it is a graduation. It's the transition to a higher class in the university of existence,
Featuring new discoveries, new dimensions of understanding.
and higher-order challenges for a refined character.
But to qualify for that cosmic evolution, the framework requires a very specific psychological prerequisite, right?
Yes, it zeroes in on one defining characteristic of the inhabitants of a heavenly society.
They sit face to face on couches, completely free of something called Ghill.
Ghill is the linchpin of this entire sociological thesis.
What does it mean exactly?
Linguistically, it translates to malice, spite, secret enmity, or hidden resentment.
Okay.
It has been described using a regional Punjabi metaphor from the archive as a tangled knot or a twisted rope inside the heart.
A twisted rope in the heart. Oh man, we have all experienced the physical manifestation of that.
We definitely have.
You are sitting across a conference table from a colleague, or maybe at a dinner table with a relative. You're smiling, making polite conversation, but internally, your stomach is just in knots.
Because you are holding on to a past grievance.
Exactly. You are deeply suspicious of their motives, or terrified they are quietly judging your failures. That invisible, suffocating tension that is Ghill.
Now, extrapolate that feeling across an entire civilization.
Oh, a society choked by Ghill. It would burn an astronomical amount of energy just managing its own paranoia.
It is a permanent prisoner's dilemma. No one can afford to cooperate fully because everyone assumes the other person will defect.
Wow. So the assertion here is that a heavenly society is defined by the surgical removal of that psychological knot.
Exactly. And the result of removing that knot is a state called surah.
Which is translated as joy.
Yes.
Okay.
But it goes much deeper than the fleeting dopamine hit of, say, eating a good meal. It is a structural, foundational joy born of absolute psychological safety.
Consider the sociology of seating arrangements, which the text specifically highlights with that phrase, sitting face to face on couches.
Right, seating is usually a geometry of power and paranoia.
Throughout human history, in ancient royal courts, modern boardrooms, who is allowed to sit behind whom? Who has their back against the wall to prevent an assassination?
But in this society, they sit face to face. There is no hierarchy of fear.
You can look directly into the eyes of another human being and know with absolute certainty that there is no hidden agenda. Zero envy.
The cognitive load that would lift from a human mind is just staggering.
To exist in a community where you never have to guard your words, where you never have to parse a compliment for passive aggression.
Or someone else's brilliant success does not trigger a threat response in your own ego.
The very act of unshielded face-to-face interaction generates this surah. You don't need a screen to entertain you. The social environment itself is the engine of joy.
It is the ultimate optimization of social physics.
A society that regulates its passions and eradicates mutual suspicion stops bleeding energy and starts building.
But this brings us to the most critical operational question.
Which is?
How does a fractured, deeply cynical society actually get there? Because merely wishing for an end to malice doesn't untangle the knot.
Right. We have diagnosed the disease, and we have the blueprint for the cure. But how do you administer it?
The framework provides the mechanism through the narrative of Prophet Ibrahim, or Abraham.
and what we can call the engine of reason.
Exactly.
I really want to emphasize that this is a radical departure from how these stories are usually told.
It really is. The narrative focuses on the moment angels visit an elderly Ibrahim to deliver miraculous news.
That his barren wife will have a son endowed with deep knowledge.
Right, and in classical religious storytelling, the expected response from a devout figure is, well, immediate, silent submission.
Falling to the knees in blind acceptance. But Ibrahim pushes back.
He does.
He asks the messengers, "On what basis are you giving me this news?" He demands the underlying logic. He wants the receipts.
He asks for the ground, the cause, the reason. And the framework highlights this to establish the epistemology of faith.
So Ibrahim is not questioning the existence of the divine.
No, his foundational belief is intact, but his demand for reason proves that in this paradigm, true faith is absolutely not blind submission.
It is not turning off your critical thinking faculties just because something supernatural happened.
Genuine faith requires the satisfaction of the intellect. It requires understanding the how and the why.
Because if faith cannot withstand the scrutiny of reason, it is fragile.
And a civilization built on fragile, blind obedience will eventually shatter under pressure.
This perfectly connects to another profound interaction Ibrahim has in the text, where he directly asks God, "Show me how you bring the dead to life."
Right.
And again, he explicitly states, "It's not that I lack faith, it is that I want my heart to be satisfied."
This specific inquiry, how to bring the dead to life, it operates on multiple frequencies.
Okay, what do you mean?
While it addresses biological resurrection, within the context of social physics, it is an inquiry into civilizational rehabilitation.
Oh, I see.
Ibrahim is asking for the methodology to take a society that is spiritually, intellectually, and morally dead.
A society that has succumbed to its unbridled passions.
Yes, and revive it into a functional, living entity.
And the response he gets is this incredibly complex analogy. God tells Ibrahim to take 4 birds, tame them, train them to come to him, place them on separate hills, and then call them.
And when he calls, they fly to him.
Now, in a lot of folklore, this is reduced to a magic trick. Like the birds are chopped into pieces, the pieces are scattered, and they magically reassemble in midair.
Right, but diving into the linguistic roots of the Arabic words used here changes the entire paradigm.
The words don't mean slaughter.
No. The linguistic roots denote a process of making something familiar, pulling it close, and conditioning it. It implies taming and training, not slaughtering and reanimating.
That completely reframes the analogy. It turns it into a masterclass on the psychology of leadership and social change.
God is giving Ibrahim the blueprint for reviving a dead nation.
Taming a wild bird sounds poetic, but rehabilitating a deeply broken society is a grueling, traumatic process.
Oh, absolutely.
If you have ever tried to rescue and rehabilitate a feral animal, you know it is not a Disney movie. It is governed by a trauma response.
You reach out your hand with food, and it bites you.
Yes, you provide shelter, and it tries to tear it down. The animal doesn't know you're trying to save it. It only knows its own fear and its unbridled instincts.
And that is the exact emotional toll required of a transformative leader.
When you try to guide a nation out of its toxic habits, the populace will mock you.
They will insult you. They will actively try to destroy you.
Because you are threatening the status quo they are intoxicated by.
Exactly. To succeed, the leader must entirely master their own internal beast. When the fractured society bites the hand that feeds it, the leader cannot react with unbridled anger.
Or a bruised ego, you cannot take it personally.
You must swallow your ego completely. It requires methodical, agonizingly patient training.
You call them to a higher purpose, and they scatter.
You bring them close again. You offer the sustenance of objective truth.
You demonstrate the superiority of the divine code through your own regulated behavior.
And slowly, over generations, you rewire their trauma response.
Until eventually, when you call them toward justice, they fly to you. That is the physics of bringing a dead nation back to life.
It is a beautiful process, but we also have to look at the failure state of that physics.
Right. What happens when the structural damage to a society is so profound and the intoxication of the passions is so deeply entrenched that the populace permanently rejects the training?
When the load-bearing walls of their morality are completely compromised.
Yeah, what then?
That brings us directly to the next phase of the angel's mission. After explaining the mechanics of revival to Ibrahim, they announce their primary objective.
They are traveling to the people of Lut, or Lot.
Yes, the angels categorize this society as mujrimin,
Which means
It's a term denoting criminals, transgressors, or people who have fundamentally and violently severed themselves from the natural order.
they have crossed the event horizon of social physics.
Precisely. They represent the control group in our laboratory of history.
If Ibrahim represents the slow, methodical construction of a civilization, let's people represent a society that has enshrined the beast in man as its highest cultural value.
They have reached the point of no return. And the operational protocols for surviving a systemic collapse of this magnitude are brutally strict.
The instructions given to Prophet Lut and the few remaining individuals aligned with the divine code introduce the concept of hijra, or migration.
But this is not a casual relocation.
Right. They are commanded to leave in the dead of night, to walk behind the group to ensure everyone is moving forward, and this is key. Under absolutely no circumstances are they permitted to look back.
We really need to unpack the psychology of Hijra and that specific command not to look back.
We see this motif everywhere, right? Orpheus looking back at Eurydice, the folklore of people turning to stone or pillars of salt.
Yes, but sociologically, what does looking back actually signify during a civilizational collapse?
Tell me.
It represents the lethal danger of the sunk cost fallacy and lingering cognitive dissonance.
Oh, wow.
Hydra is an amputation. You are severing yourself from a highly contagious terminal disease.
You are leaving behind your property, your generational wealth.
Your social standing, and often your extended family. Psychologically, to look back is to demonstrate that your internal reality is still tethered to the dying system.
So you are escaping a society built on exploitation, but as you run, a part of your brain is mourning the loss of the luxuries that exploitation provided.
Exactly. You miss the status. You miss the familiar rhythm of the corruption.
And if you harbor that nostalgia, you haven't actually migrated.
Your physical body is walking away, but your psychological architecture is still anchored in the doomed city. You are carrying the contagion with you.
Which makes the fate of Lut's wife a devastating case study here. The narrative is completely unflinching. She does not make it.
Despite being married to a prophet of immense spiritual stature, she is destroyed alongside the city.
It is the ultimate repudiation of tribalism.
It really is. Human beings naturally default to the belief that biological proximity or social association grants immunity.
Like, I'm with him, so I'm safe.
Right. But the text brutally severs that assumption. Biological DNA will not save you in the face of civilizational collapse. Only ideological DNA matters.
Her heart remained tethered to the transgression of her people, and therefore the laws of social physics dictated that she share their physical fate.
Biological DNA will not save you. Only ideological DNA matters. That destroys any notion of riding on someone else's coattails.
You have to do the internal psychological work yourself.
And when an entire society refuses to do that work, the consequences bleed out of the psychological realm and manifest in the physical environment.
Right. The text describes the destruction of the cities of the plain as a total systemic cascade. A terrifying sound indicative of a massive seismic event strikes at sunrise.
Followed by a rain of baked clay stones.
And the entire topography of the city is physically inverted, turned upside down.
It is systems theory in action. A civilization is a subsystem operating within the larger system of the natural world.
And when the social subsystem becomes so violently misaligned with natural laws, the friction generates heat.
And eventually, the larger physical system corrects the anomaly. The Earth itself becomes violently hostile to its inhabitants.
They are crushed by the very environment they thought they had conquered.
And this raises the most urgent question of the entire framework.
How do we avoid becoming that wreckage? How do you recognize the micro-fractures in the pillars of your own society before the earthquake hits?
To answer that, the text provides a diagnostic tool.
Right. It describes the doomed people of Lut in verse 72 as being in a state of demhoshi, which translates to intoxication.
But they were not simply drunk on alcohol.
Yo.
They were intoxicated by their own hubris. It is the drunkenness of the status quo.
When an entire society normalizes malicious, unbridled behavior, that insanity becomes the new baseline.
You look around, and because everyone is participating in the exploitation, the collective delusion shields you from reality.
It's the momentum of a dying system. You think, well, the stock market is at an all-time high, our tech is unprecedented, our entertainment is spectacular. How could we possibly be on the verge of collapse?
That hubris acts as a powerful narcotic. It renders the masses completely blind to the fact that the engine of their society is tearing itself apart.
But while the masses are stumbling blindly in this state of intoxication, the framework introduces a profoundly different psychological archetype in verses 72 through 75.
It calls them the Mutawassimin.
Mutawassimin. And the root of the word is translated as the sign readers.
These are the individuals capable of true civilizational forensics.
So what does a mutawassim actually do?
A mutawassim is someone who can observe a seemingly minor trace, a subtle data point, or a shift in societal behavior, and accurately deduce the massive hidden reality driving it.
They separate the signal from the noise.
Precisely.
I want to make this concrete for the listener. Think of a massive suspension bridge.
Okay, a bridge.
The intoxicated masses are driving their cars across the bridge every day, listening to the radio, completely oblivious to the physical forces holding them up.
Right, just going about their day.
But a mutawassim is like a brilliant structural engineer. They walk onto the bridge and they don't look at the shiny paint. They listen to the specific acoustic ping of the tension cables in the wind.
They notice a millimeter of shear stress on a primary bolt.
Exactly. And from that tiny, subtle sign, they can calculate the exact mathematical inevitability that the bridge will snap in high winds.
That is the exact cognitive framework. The Mutawassimin understand that the laws of social physics are just as unforgiving as the laws of structural engineering.
They observe a society normalizing extreme wealth disparity, institutionalizing malice that Ghill we discussed.
And abandoning the engine of reason in favor of reactive tribalism.
They run the math. They know the equation only balances one way, and they adjust their trajectory long before the collapse begins.
But I have to push back a little here.
Ah.
Isn't that an incredibly paralyzing way to live? If you are constantly scanning the horizon for the microfractures of societal collapse, don't you just become a paranoid doomsday prepper hiding in a bunker?
That is a critical distinction to make. Reading the signs is not about succumbing to paralyzing doom. It is about empowerment and course correction.
Okay.
The mutawassimin are not paralyzed by fear because their intellect is not enslaved by the passion of anxiety. They read the signs so they can engage the engine of reason.
Regulate their own internal state.
Yes, and actively build the face-to-face trust required to weather the storm. They use the data to construct lifeboats, not to dig graves.
And the data is readily available, which brings us perfectly back to our opening visualization, the open highway.
Right. The framework points out a stunning historical and geographical reality regarding the ruins of Let's people.
The flipped cities and the baked clay were not buried in some inaccessible hidden valley at the edge of the world.
No, they were located directly on an established, heavily traveled trade route.
Every time the merchants of Mecca traveled north to Syria for commerce, their caravans literally had to navigate through the devastation.
The source explicitly states, and indeed, those cities are right on an established road.
God left the wreckage on the shoulder of the highway.
It is an intentional, permanent exhibition in the laboratory of human history. The ruins are not there to be a spooky campfire story to entertain passing merchants.
They are placed in plain sight specifically for the mutawassimin of all future generations to study.
It is the ultimate proof of the thesis. The framework is basically screaming at us, look at the wreckage, do not dismiss it as primitive, ancient history.
Apply your engine of reason. Decode their trajectory.
What internal passions did they leave unbridled? How did their intellect become a lawyer for their greed?
How do they respond to the warnings?
And once you have mapped their collapse, hold that map up to your own society.
Because if you are driving the exact same route, the social physics guarantees you will end up as the next exhibit on the highway.
It is a chilling realization, but it places the power entirely back in our hands. History is not something happening to us. It is a mechanism trying to teach us.
We have the agency to regulate the beast.
To untangle the Ghill from our hearts, to demand reason over blind momentum, and to steer off the path of destruction.
We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today, walking through the psychological infernos and the mechanics of heavenly societies.
We really have. And in our next and final session on this archive, Lecture 4 of 4, we will conclude our deep dive into Surah Al-Hijr.
We will be analyzing the mysterious 7 oft-repeated verses.
And unpacking the ultimate mission of the prophet, which is not merely surviving the highway, but bringing a message of absolute grandeur to a fractured world.
Before we close the lab for today, I want to leave you with one final lingering question based on everything we have uncovered about civilizational forensics.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine that the trajectory of our own modern, hyper-connected society were to suddenly freeze today. Imagine our gleaming metropolitan skylines, our massive server farms, our algorithmic feeds, and our global financial institutions were suddenly turned into ruins, left abandoned on the open highway of the future.
Wow.
What exact social physics, what unbridled, normalized passions, what fatal neglect of the engine of reason, what deep-seated systemic malice would the Mutawasmin of the year 3000 deduce that we fatally ignored?
What a question. We leave you to ponder your own reflection in the wreckage. Until next time, keep your eyes on the road and keep reading the signs.